Okay, in this lecture, I'm going to cover some libraries and frameworks that can make it much easier to do web development, particularly when you get past a certain scale. So there's a bunch of libraries and frameworks out there that have been developed by third parties to make your web development easier. Typically, a fairly small amount of code does some useful functions. That's typically what libraries are. As frameworks, typically larger, more complicated, and maybe impose some kind of architectural pattern on your application, such as the model view controller pattern. So Angular I'm going to talk about, which is more of a framework, and libraries are more like jQuery and Bootstrap. Now, I'm introducing them at this stage of the course because I think it's going to be easier for you to understand and appreciate and get the most out of libraries and frameworks if you've already got a good grounding in JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. If you start with using libraries and frameworks and try and sort of avoid the messy stuff in JavaScript, you're not going to avoid it altogether, obviously, then you're going to, in some ways, limit yourself and limit your understandings. One reason is, suppose you implement everything in jQuery for all of your coursework, let's say, and then next year you go and work for a company that doesn't use jQuery, yeah? So then you're obviously going to have to learn JavaScript a bit more from scratch and go back to the drawing board, and that's going to make everything harder for you. Whereas if you understand JavaScript and can work with JavaScript really well, then using jQuery will be like an added bonus on top of that, rather than a sort of limitation on your understanding of web technologies. So I think it's much better that you use frameworks by all means, use libraries by all means. All I'm asking in this course is that you list the ones that you're using, and that with the more if it's not one of the ones covered in this lecture, you should probably check it with me or with one of your module leader. So to use them, there's two ways in which you typically use libraries and frameworks. One way is you download the library or the framework, you put it in the same folder or a subfolder of your website, and then you just include it like normal JavaScript. The other way is just to use the remote copy, which is kind of the easier way in many ways. As long as the remote copy doesn't go down, you just specify like the URL. For example, this is the remote copy of jQuery on the Google repository. And so you can just specify the link as a remote link instead of a local link. So this is better in some ways because maybe multiple pages on your browser will already have loaded jQuery from the source. So in which case it'll be cached somewhere and it'll load much faster. And then also, you don't have to mess around downloading it and distributing jQuery with your website. Obviously, if Google API goes down or you're trying to test it on a plane or something, then this is going to have some limitations. So in this lecture, I'm going to cover a few of the most obvious and most standard third-party libraries and frameworks. Don't feel that you have to use these, you don't at all, or feel that you have to be limited to these, as I explained. But be careful when using ones that do too much, or just clear them with the module leader. Okay, so in this lecture, I'm going to cover jQuery and the jQuery UI, Bootstrap, AngularJS, and TypeScript. So jQuery and jQuery UI gives you these very easy ways of accessing and manipulating the document object model. That's really what's good about jQuery. The rest is kind of bells and whistles, really. So, you can use these kind of CSS selectors to pick out elements, some of these very simple methods in jQuery. You can save yourself a lot of typing, and that applies also to Ajax stuff in jQuery. And it's also got a lot of sort of, sparkly stuff like transition effects, drag and drop functionality, widgets, and so on. So if you feel that you need a progress bar or, accordion effect or something like that, jQuery's probably got it, and it's very easy to use the jQuery ones. So to use jQuery, so as I explained, you just have a script. In this case, I'm using the Google APIs version. So you just create a link to that, and it'll download it, and you can then use jQuery in your page. So one of the beautiful things about jQuery is the way in which you can so easily select elements. So it supports, so if you want to access a particular HTML element and change its properties or whatever, use these jQuery selectors with a $, these kind of smooth braces, and then the selector in quotation marks. So you remember all that stuff from CSS, right? We can select like a div that has a particular ID. We can select by class name. ID is, so this is much shorter than document, get element by ID, my ID. This is like, many fewer characters. We can select all of the span elements, or inputs whose type is password, and so on and so forth, right? We're going to go into all the details here, but it's a very neat, clean way of selecting the different parts of your page so you can manipulate them. It's also got its own fancy selectors as well. Once you've got a reference to your HTML element using jQuery, you can then manipulate it. And two of the obvious ways would be to access the HTML within the element, and you can also access the text within the element. And you can get and set the values of individual element attributes using the attr method. So HTML is similar to inner HTML, so you've got endless stuff about document get element by ID, and then .inner HTML to get the HTML. And that enables you to manipulate all of the HTML of an element, everything that's inside the tags. And you can also strip out the HTML tags inside the HTML and just access the text. So just to explain what that means, so if we've got a paragraph here. This has got like inside the paragraph, there's a span tags wrapping this hello bit of text, right? Hello world, yeah? So if we do alert P, so we're selecting P in this case, .html, that's going to pull out everything between the start of the tag and the opening tag and the closing tag. So in this case, if we alert, we see all the span HTML tags. Whereas if we do alert p.text, it's going to get rid of these spans, and so all we see is hello world. We can also use HTML to change the document. So once we've selected P, we can then do .html, and instead of just empty braces, we can specify what the HTML should be. So we can set the paragraph contents. In this case, changing it from hello world with the span stuff to goodbye world. So and that's what we see when we look at the HTML again. CSS properties in an element, we can view and manipulate using the CSS method. So in this case, got a div with the ID click me. So again, beautiful $click me just pulls out that div with that specific ID. And then we can do .css. That's the jQuery method for accessing the CSS. And I want to, in this case, access the color element, see what color has been set. So if I log that, I get the RGB 25500 because it's been set to color red. And then, of course, I can use CSS to set to the property in the same way as the HTML method. So here I have a div with style color red, and I do click me again, picking that div out, .css, and here's the key, and here's the value. So that's the CSS property, and that's the value I want to set that property to. And this time here, I'm changing the color of this div. Click here, it's going to change from red to green when this code's invoked. You can also use jQuery to show and hide elements. So it's a sort of wrapper for the CSS property that lets you do that. So show and hide methods, and you can set a speed for this transition in milliseconds. And also specify a function that's executed when the transition is complete. So a little example, a couple of paragraphs, hello world 2. Here's a script. So first we hide these two elements just by selecting all the elements p.hide. Does save you a lot of typing, jQuery, I must say. And then p.show. Now, firstly, I'm specifying the time of the transition, how long it will take to show these paragraphs. And then this is the function that will be executed, anonymous function, be executed when these two paragraphs have completely appeared. And in this case, all it's going to do is say shows over, and it'll execute that function twice because we're showing two paragraphs in this case. So I can give a little demo. Okay, so let's refresh it. So first it hides them, then it shows them over 2 seconds. When each one's shown, it calls a function that generates alert saying shows over. So pretty basic. So it's showing them over 2 seconds, then executing a function that's generating an alert. jQuery also allows us to do event handling in a very neat and friendly way. And we can capture these events. So we capture events, and then we can assign the events to inner or global functions. So what are we doing here? Yep, so I think I explained that no, I don't. So let's talk it through now. So here we've got a div, green div, as I'll show you. I'll show you what it does, and we'll come back to the code. I think it's probably better. So let's go to the next piece. So here we have a green div. And then as I move the mouse over, if it's green, it changes it to red. I'll do it slowly. Yeah, and if it's red, it changes it to green. So here's the div. width 300 pixels, height 300 pixels, background color green. Then what we do is we have an event handler here. We listen, we grab the green div, and we assign its mouse move event to the change color function that we've written. So this change color function is called whenever the mouse moves over that div. And all it does is it finds the background color property. If it's equal to green, it changes it to red. If it's equal, and otherwise, it changes it to green. So a very simple little example of event handling. I've given you a demo already. And there's obviously a bunch of different events that jQuery handles in exactly the same way. If you want your elements to slide, if you, for example, have a navigation menu and you want to hover over the menu and have your sub-menu kind of slide out, that's sort of useful function of that, then we can do this. jQuery has some slide functions. We can use slide up, where we specify how long we want the slide to take and the function that's executed when it's slid up, or slide down, in which case it slides down. So again, a little example. Again, I don't think I go through the code. No, so let's do the demo and then I'll talk you through the code. Yes, it's the book, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so here we have a book. So when I click on here, it slides up. And once this transition is completed, it executes a function that changes the background color to yellow on the paragraph. So here we have the div with the ID click me. That's going to listen for the event of clicking. Here we have the book image with a certain width and height. First, I grab the book and hide it. And then when click me, and then I have the click event, and I assign that to an anonymous function that handles that click event, and it causes the book to slide down, as I showed you. And when it's completed, it executes another anonymous function with another, with an anonymous function with an anonymous function here, and that will change the background color to yellow. All these bits of code are included in the example code on the course website, so you can have a look at these demos and see how they work for yourselves if you like to. So another typical event you might need to invoke is document ready. This is similar to window on load event, and make sure that the code is only executed when the window is loaded. So not particularly exciting, but we just have document ready. We're going to execute my function here, and my function is, that's what happens. I'm going to cover Ajax next term, but as you'll discover next term, Ajax is kind of fiddly. You've got this kind of XML, HTTP request stuff, and jQuery sort of enables you to write the same functionality with less keystrokes. So if you want to know more about the API, have a look at the full details. So all of the functionality of jQuery is documented in the API, and you can look at the different methods, what they do, and get some code examples as well. I don't doubt. So next I'm going to talk about jQuery UI. So UI is a sort of additional library that sits on top of jQuery. It's got some additional selectors. It's got sort of collision handling, a few more fancy sort of stuff like drag and drop, this kind of stuff. It's got a very fancy library of widgets, well, not that fancy, medium fancy, let's say, and some more effects, some of which are rather pointless, as I'll show you. So to use jQuery UI, first we include jQuery, and then we've got a separate library that we include in addition to that. So it's got lots of fancy effects. Now, the trouble with these effects are they look cool like once or twice, but if you use them a lot, then your sort of website becomes some kind of caricature of jQuery, right? It just has that annoying jQuery style, if you like. So use them with caution, I recommend. Or create your own effects, or fiddle with the effects somehow. So here's a little bit of example. So let's just show you how to use it. So here we've got a green div. We grab the green div, and we say that when we click on that, set up an event handler, so when we click on it, we're going to call this explode function here. And then we do the explode function will change the background color to red. So again, using the CSS method. And then it applies an effect. We use the jQuery effect method, and then there's like a string description of the effect we want to apply. So there's lots of different effects you can apply jQuery. So we call the effect method and specify which effect we want to do. And that's all there is to it. So when we click on that, it's going to change the background color and apply the explosion effect. So, very exciting. So let's go to that. So here we have our green div, and when I click on it, we get the explosion effect. And as you can see, it's all kind of all right, but let's not, get too excited about it. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the effects. So you'll see what I mean. So we've got lots on the jQuery website. You can demo some of them. So this is like the pulsate effect. Some of these are kind of handy to sort of give users feedback about errors and so on. You've got bounce, you've got, blind. I'm not going to go through them all, right? Oh, that's like a slide one. And puff, heaven knows what that is. Oh yeah, okay. So lots of different effects. Used with discretion, they're probably okay, but used in excess, it could be extremely annoying. jQuery also has lots of widgets. So general rule is, if you're building a website, don't labor mightily to build something that's been done, to do something that's been done already, right? So if you've got a date picker, right? If you need a date picker for some reason, you could spend a couple of days building your own one beautifully, which would almost certainly have some annoying flaws and wouldn't work on all browsers. Or you could just use a jQuery date picker. And the same goes for, a lot of this other stuff, like a slider, spinner, tabs, and so on. So previous, versions of my own website, I built tabs by myself from scratch using CSS, HTML, and images, and so on and so forth. Took a while, right? But I could have just used the jQuery one and would have saved me a lot of time. So I'll just show you some of these kind of widgets. Again, to be used in moderation, but in moderation, I think they're very valuable. So like accordion, what a pain would it be to kind of create an accordion from scratch. So this is accordion, you've got like different sections and you click on it and it makes the different sections visible. That's kind of handy, right? And you've got, lots of different things. That's just, like a dialogue. If you're using a single page web application, you get a whole dialogue coming up and you sort of move it around. Pretty handy, right? Or spinners or, so on and so forth, right? So, sort of spinners like that. I'm not going to go through them all, but you get the idea. You can probably style them to some extent yourself, again, make it sort of fit in with the general style of your website. Another feature of jQuery, which will be, again, very useful in certain contexts, is to enable drag and drop on your website. So if you're making a card game, this is perfect, right? Because then you can build a solitaire game, for example, and then you can drag the card, and when you release the card, it will drop it somewhere, and it'll tell you that it's dropped it somewhere, and can be very handy. So I don't know if do I go through the details? Nope. So I'll give you a demo first, and then I'll talk through the code. Okay, so this is drag and drop. So I can pick up stuff, and when I drop it on another div, it triggers a function that tells me which div has been dropped onto which div. So pretty handy if you're playing cards. Maybe less, and maybe you could utilize it in other kind of games. So how this works, we have a draggable div. Well, I've just given it that ID, draggable div. That's the one we're going to drag. That's green. And then we've got two divs. Oh yeah, I didn't show you. We've got two divs actually. So because there's so lousy resolution. So if we drop it onto the other div, it says it's dropped onto div 2, and then it's dropped onto div 1. So we've actually got two divs there. It's got two divs that it's going to be can be dropped onto. And to make it div draggable, it's so easy. We just do draggable. We just pick out the div using the selector, and then we call the draggable method. And then we grab our droppable div and make them droppable. And then we have then we specify what happens when the drop event happens. So when something's dropped on there, we're going to call the handle drop event function, which is here. So both of these call the handle drop event function. This has an event and a UI thing, whatever that is. We kind of need the UI. So that enables us to grab the HTML element that's been dragged over, but that's been dropped on these other elements. So user interface, whatever UI stands for, we can basically pull out a reference to the green div that's been dragged on top of another div, and then we can say, which div has been dragged onto which div. And this is the div that's calling this method, and then the UI is the div that's been dropped on top of it. So we've got the draggable attribute ID, so that's pulling out the ID of the one that's been dragged, and this attribute, that's the ID of the one that's been dropped onto. Again, you've got this code in the example code. You can have a look at it, have a fiddle with it if you want to implement drag and drop for a card game, for example. Okay, so that's just a little taster, a little overview of jQuery. It's not meant to be a solid, tutorial. We could spend weeks on this if we want to, but we're not going to. Next up is Bootstrap. Originally developed at Twitter. It's very popular. HTML, CSS, JavaScript framework, and enables you to design websites that adjust to different kind of screen sizes. That's the sort of the motivating force behind Bootstrap. It will sort of dynamically configure and rejiggle itself so that you're making the most of the available screen space. And it will do that in a cross-browser compatible manner, so that's good too, right? So it's compatible with modern browsers, probably compatible with older browsers as well. So Bootstrap makes it very easy to do layouts for your page, but it's also kind of annoying. I started redesigning my website, and sometimes it's great to have everything sort of shuffle around as you change the window size, but sometimes that completely messes up your entire design. So, horses for courses kind of thing. If you want to knock something up quick and make something that looks slick, which is probably what you're going to want to do in your coursework too, then maybe Bootstrap's the perfect thing. But if you want to do something that's more your own work and doesn't have a Bootstrap look and feel to it, then maybe you're going to want to implement something from scratch. So how to use it? Well, you can do same as all these libraries. You can download it and then create a link to it on your local system, or you can just use the one that's available on Google or whatever. In this case, it's on Max CDN for some reason. This is the W3 Schools link. But basically, you create a link. You can download it, or you can create a link to it from another third-party content delivery network. So you need two things, well, three things actually. You need the Bootstrap CSS because it has a lot of CSS in it. You need the jQuery because it uses jQuery probably to do the adjustment stuff, and it also needs some the Bootstrap JavaScript. So you need the CSS, Bootstrap CSS, Bootstrap JavaScript, and the jQuery as well. So let's show how it works. So firstly, you must use the HTML5 doc type, and then you need this meta tag inside the header. And then your contents should be wrapped in one of two containers. So container is like a fixed width container, and then they'll do some juggling to make most of the screen space. And then with fluid provides this full width container that will sort of expand and contract with the page. So here's my example. So I said we need this meta stuff in the header, plus the various links to the style sheet and the JavaScript. Then we're going to wrap it in this, the div has to have the class container, because I'm going to have a fixed width layout. And then as you'll see, this is like, you can always recognize a Bootstrap page because it's got this kind of particular kind of font and look and feel to it. I'm sure you can change it, but most people don't. And so here's my first Bootstrap page. So it's got the CSS is applying, changing the style of the heading, and there's the text within the container. So thus far, we haven't achieved much except changing the font, but we'll come to how it's actually quite useful. So that's all the stuff we need to include, and then we've got the div class container, then it will work. Now, this is where Bootstrap is useful. What it gives you is a way of organizing your content into columns. And they have 12 columns across the page, and you can group these columns together to create wider columns. So it enables you to create a layout very easily, and this layout will adjust itself depending on the size of the screen that you're viewing it on. That's sort of useful in many circumstances. So to make this work, to use this grid system, first we create a row. So it's a bit like a table. You have rows, and within the rows you have columns, and you have to have the columns have the different types of columns. You've got like extra small, small, medium, large, so and these have kind of certain default properties with them, associated with them, which I'll explain. So you have rows. Within the rows you have columns, and the columns have both the sort of small, medium, large kind of thing, and then they have the number of the span of the columns. So in this case, this is 4 columns wide, this particular column, but it could be 1 column wide, it could be 12 column wide. And the numbers always have to add up to 12 for each row, or you have knows to get some error, or it'll look weird. So here's a little example. So here's our container class wrapping everything as specified, and then we've got the rows. So here we've got 2 rows. This is 1 row, and this is another row. Within the row, we've got, in this case, 3 columns, each one of which is four columns wide kind of thing. So we've got, and it's small. I'm using a small columns here, which have certain default settings. So we're having column small 4, that's like 4 here, and then 4 and 4, and so these 3 4s add up to 12. So that's his first row here. And then the second row here, we've got a column small 12. So again, this is just a single column that goes all the way across, and I've changed the background color to orange to make it up visible. And so what you can see here is that when this is viewed on a narrow browser, everything sort of goes vertical, so we can see everything as maximal size. But on a bigger browser, the first row spreads out across the entire width, and then we've got the second row underneath it. So show a little demo. So here's my page. Let's just pull it out. So if we've got it on got it small, you can see it resizes, so the small columns kind of go vertically, and then whereas if we maximize it, then they spread out across to use all the available screen space. Okay. So here's off W3 schools table, but that basically explains there's a bunch of different settings depending on whether you use the small, extra small, small, or medium, large columns, and they've got different defaults and different behaviors, which you can pick as you need them. Bootstrap will also do clever things with images. It will kind of scale the images dynamically to make use of the available screen space, which can be useful in some circumstances. So here's a little responsive image class. So here we just give it the class image responsive, and then it will scale to fit the size of the column that's included within. So here we got the image here with a wide page. It's about the same width as the text in that case. But you can see here with a different size page, it's sort of expanded. It's sort of increased the size of the image, and it's actually much wider than the text there. So it's sort of dynamically reconfiguring the image to make it look useful, make it look good on the page in theory. But of course, if you've got a particular design in mind, all this sort of shuffling around and resizing things can be pretty annoying. Bootstrap also has a bunch of widget type stuff like alerts, buttons, badges, carousel, collapsible, some of which are also implemented by jQuery. And many of the other JavaScript libraries will probably give you progress bars as well. So there's probably like 10 different progress bars you can use if you wanted to. Okay, so that's Bootstrap. Now I'm going to say a little bit about AngularJS. So AngularJS is not simple. It's not trivial. I found it quite complicated. I'm sure if you got right under the skin of it, it would be fantastic, perhaps, or perhaps not. So I'm going to introduce you to it in a very rudimentary way, but in no way does this constitute a detailed or deep analysis of AngularJS. So it's developed designed for single-page web applications, such as the one you're going to develop in Coursework 3. So it would be no bad thing for Coursework 3 if you got to grips with Angular and used Angular for that, because it's completely, I even think mean, right? It's like the mean stack, right? The MongoDB, Express, I think it's Angular, and then and Node, right? So probably Angular is part of the mean stack from what I remember. So if you want to be a mean developer, you should probably use Angular in your third piece of coursework. Maintained by Google, so obviously it's complicated, slightly cool, but probably quite rigorous. Based on a model view controller architecture. So I'll just say a little bit about that. So model view controller is a sort of classic paradigm in software development. So whenever you're building, whatever application you're building in computer science, you should probably follow something like this pattern, okay? You should have some kind of data behind the scenes that constitutes your model, and then what the user sees should be some kind of view of that model generated from the model and separate from that model. And then as the user interacts with that view, they're going to change the data in the model, which in turn is going to change the view. That's the idea. So we have the model, which is like what's behind the scenes, some kind of data structure. The model, is used to produce this view. The user interacts with the view, causing changes through the controller or via the controller, and that causes changes to the model, and so it goes on. It's like a sort of circular kind of thing. The user sees the view, sends control signals back to the model, which can changes the view again, and so on and so forth. So AngularJS is based on this architecture, and as I said, any piece of software you build that has a graphical dimension to it, you should think about using this kind of architecture as well. It's been well established as being more sensible than mixing everything up in the view, for example. So what you get is you build a template, which is essentially you put a few annotations or attributes into your HTML. Then Angular will compile this template into this kind of view model sort of thing, program kind of is. And then these two will sort of run and interact with each other, and that'll be your website. So to make it work, you need to include this ng-app attribute in the element of the part of the HTML of your HTML that you want to form the root of your web application. So this can be the HTML tag, or it could be a sort of div that's sort of further inside your HTML. So if you wanted to make the whole page a web app, then we call it ng-app. We'd say HTML ng-app. Then Angular has these expressions in these double curly braces. And then what Angular does is it evaluates these expressions and inserts the result into the document object model. So it has this kind of loading process where it's compiling the template that you give it and converting it into this running application. And so it starts at the root ng-app root element. It processes all of the directives and bindings that it finds, and then it waits for events, and then does this whole model view controller thing. So here's a little example. We include the appropriate JavaScript as usual. We include ng-app. In this case, we're making the whole page a web application. And then we have these double curly braces. And what Angular will do is it will look inside these curly braces and evaluate this expression. In this case, it's kind of simple, right? It's just world plus exclamation mark. So what we'll see in our Hello World Angular application is just Hello World. It's not terribly exciting. Now, if we wanted to do more sort of fancy stuff, we can create this kind of model view architecture within Angular. And sometimes that can be really useful. So we have this idea of an ng model directive that specifies which parts of the page constitute the model, and you can bind HTML stuff onto application data. And then we have the view of that data, or ways of visualizing the data within the document. So here, for example, we've got an input, and we're saying that this is like part of the model, and the ID of this part of the model, or the name of the variable that's this part of the model, that forms this part of the model, is called just name. I should have given it a better name, really. And then we have the kind of a view, which is we're binding, in this case, name, to this bit of HTML, so that this bit of HTML is linked to this bit of data. That's the idea. And we could have done it in a different way. We could have done the same thing with the input, but instead used the Angular braces and put name in there. So in this case, whatever happens here in this input field will be reflected here. So this is a kind of the model, and this is kind of the view. So let's do a little demo. So here's the input field, name. If I type, David, whatever, everything that goes into this model here is copied into name, and then name is what appears here, and I can make it appear in 20 different parts of the document. I could synchronize name with a web server, and so on and so forth. So I'm just going to go a little bit deeper into Angular, but not very deep. Now we can have default values for the variables that form part of the model. So here I can set name to Cedric, in which case Cedric's going to appear here in this kind of user element or whatever, and also appears here, because wherever name appears, it's going to be reflected there. So I've set default values here for it. And there's kind of all this kind of controller stuff. Where you can have a controller that's used to initialize and control the data in AngularJS applications. I'm not going to go far into this, but you you can specify a specific controller. It has this kind of scope parameter. The scope, you can have different scopes within your application. The scope controls where particular variables exist. And so you can create different scopes, not that you ever probably want to, unless you've got to really big applications. So we can use this controller, has a scope. We initialize the controller so it gets going. The controller has a particular scope. And within that scope, we have the name variable, and we can then set a default for that name, which equal to John. You can probably do tons more stuff with Angular, but I'm not going to go into it here. It's too complicated. I'm only going to give a brief, so this has only been a brief introduction. I think you can see already by the time you get into the scope and controller and all this kind of stuff, that really, if you wanted to use it, you're going to have to spend quite a bit of time getting under the skin of it and really understanding what's going on. So it's complex to use, but if you're building something that's large scale, probably it's well worth mastering that complexity because, you know, I have no idea if Gmail's built using this, but probably it is, right? It's kind of that kind of scale and complexity of something, then you really want to be much more rigorous about how you write code. So the final thing I want to cover is TypeScript. It's kind of a framework, I would say, probably for JavaScript. And the idea behind TypeScript is it enables large-scale applications to be built with JavaScript. So JavaScript's beautiful, right? It's flexible, it's easy, it's dynamic types and all the rest of it. But it's also got the limit. This can also be a limitation, right? If you've got lots of people working in JavaScript in a big sort of corporation or whatever, lots of code drifting around, then at a certain point, you know, you're going to end up with lots of errors and really messy debugging and solving lots of different problems. It's going to be rather difficult. So one way to reduce, so you're going to hit lots of problems with JavaScript if you try and turn it into a big enterprise-wide language. But on the other hand, there are some very good reasons for using the same programming language on client side as well as server side, right? Because if you use the same programming language on both client and server, then there's less, then your programmers who work on the client side can understand with the server side code and vice versa. They can swap between it. You can make some nice synergies between client and server. So in an ideal world, you'd use JavaScript client server, but as I said, you're going to have problems with scalability. And so the motivation behind TypeScript is to reduce those problems of scalability by adding types to JavaScript. So what you do is you add these annotations saying what type each different bits of data are, and then you have a compiler that converts your TypeScript into ordinary JavaScript. So you write TypeScript, which is basically a slightly enlarged version of JavaScript, and then you compile it, and the compilation process is going to help you to pick up some of the errors and increase your scalability of your code. So to make it work, you download and install a compiler that converts TypeScript files to JavaScript files. You can install it as a Node.js package or part of Visual Studio, because it's a Microsoft thing, right? And you know, there's some links there about how you download and install it. Basic idea is very simple. So if you've got a function, normally with JavaScript functions, you don't specify the types, you just have arguments. But here, we've got arguments here, and we're specifying the type of those arguments. And you can see that if some junior web developer has been given the task of maintaining this add function, well, he can constrain how it's used and write it much more accurately if we know that left and right are numbers, right? If he knows that left and right are numbers, doesn't have to check that they're strings or some weird stuff's being passed into the function, then he can write cleaner code, and it's going to be easier for him to maintain that code and share it with other people. So in this case, we're saying left, colon, and then this is the type of this argument to the function, and then in right, that's the argument's name, and then this is the type of that argument. And number here says that the function as a whole returns a number. It doesn't return a string or anything like that. It still lets you work with weak or dynamically typed structures. You just give it the type any, but you have to be explicit about giving it a weak type. And then you can create, using TypeScript, you can create classes that look a lot like Java, really. So you can have like a class person here, and you can have like private, public, all this kind of stuff. And then when you have your sort of variables in your class, you can specify the type of those variables. And with the methods, again, you can specify the types of the arguments and so on. So it's and then all of this gets bunged through the TypeScript compiler, and out comes just ordinary JavaScript that can run on the browser and can run on Node. So it doesn't restrict you, because you can then also add some ordinary JavaScript, but it just makes it much better, much more rigorous, shall we say. So that's TypeScript, and Angular and Bootstrap and jQuery and all the rest of it. There are many other libraries and frameworks. I'm not trying to say, these are the only ones that are any good. I've just picked these out because they're popular, they come up a lot, they're used by some of the bigger companies. New ones are emerging all the time. Some suggestions, so this is like the top 23 best JavaScript frameworks, the top 10 best JavaScript frameworks. Pick and choose, but don't waste lots and lots of time. There's no magic here, right? Don't waste lots of time working through the top 23 and trying them all out and hoping you'll get some magic. There is no magic. but it's worth being familiar with them. And when you've got a specific problem, you might be able to save yourself a bunch of time. Okay, so this lecture, I've been introducing you to the libraries and frameworks that will help you to create dynamic, interactive web pages. In the next lecture, we're going to go into some of the more advanced features of JavaScript, such as the many bizarre things you can do with functions and some proper object-oriented JavaScript.